A June afternoon in Michigan. 72 degrees on the field. Shirt sleeves in the run-up area. 88% humidity, nobody thought to check. The airplane was a Piper Cherokee, second time around the pattern at a small field near Howell. The pilot brought the power back and put in flaps for the descent. The engine wound down to 900 RPM and would not come back. He reached for the carburetor heat. He verified the fuel pump. Neither one restored a thing, and he put it into the grass short of the runway. The carburetor in front of him had been making ice on a summer afternoon, and almost nothing that man had ever been taught said that was possible. When were you told carb ice happens? Put the temperature range you were given in the comments. I want to see how many of us got the same wrong number. That is what Sky Ranch does. We take the figure you were handed and go find where it came from. Subscribe so you catch the next one. Air does something violent on its way into an engine. It squeezes through a narrow throat inside the carburetor called a venturi, and the instant it accelerates, its pressure falls. Fuel sprays into that stream and flashes into vapor. Both of those things steal heat, and they steal it fast. Inside that throat, the temperature drops by as much as 70 degrees. Steve Krog has been instructing pilots for more than 4 decades and writing for the Experimental Aircraft Association. He puts the figure at 70 degrees Fahrenheit of cooling in the space of a few inches. The Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association puts the typical drop nearer 60. Either number does the same work on a 72-degree day. The air outside your cowling is warm. The air inside your carburetor is below freezing. Water in that air does exactly what water does at that temperature. It builds on the throttle plate in a ring from the outside in. The passage narrows, the engine does not quit, it strangles. And that distinction is the single most important thing in this video, so hold it. A carburetor packing ice does not fail like a switch. It slowly loses the ability to breathe, and the first thing you notice is that your numbers are drifting. Here is the part I cannot get past. The National Transportation Safety Board published a safety alert on exactly this in December of 2013 and revised it 2 years later. 4 pages, free to download, still sitting there. And in it, the board states that serious carburetor icing can occur at ambient temperatures as high as 90 degrees Fahrenheit and at relative humidity as low as 35% at glide power. 90 degrees, 35% humidity. Now hold that against what your instructor drew on the whiteboard. Most of us were handed a window. Cold, damp, autumn mornings, 20 to 70 degrees, high humidity. That window is not conservative. It is smaller than the real one on both axes, which means every hour you have ever flown outside it, you are flying with the wrong model in your head. Go back to that field near Howell for a second, because the numbers there are not close to the edge of anything. 22 degrees Celsius. Dew point of 20. 88% relative humidity on a June afternoon. The board's own report described those conditions as conducive to serious icing at idle power, and its probable cause was a loss of engine power from carburetor ice caused by the pilot's delayed use of carburetor heat on the approach. Delayed, not absent. He got to the knob. The ice got there first. The FAA's advisory circular on induction icing has said for years that pilots should apply carburetor heat briefly right before takeoff and stay alert for induction icing anytime relative humidity climbs past 50%. 50%. That is a normal Tuesday in most of the country from May onward, and almost nobody flies as though it is a carb ice day. The regulation covering the cure is stranger still. Federal certification rules require the carburetor heat system to deliver a temperature rise of at least 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Not a target temperature, a rise. The rule assumes the venturi is stealing heat and demands the airplane be able to shove roughly the same amount back in. So the margin between what the venturi takes and what the law puts back is about 20 degrees. On a new airframe, on a test stand, that margin is real and measured. On a 40-year-old airplane with a heat muff wrapped around an exhaust pipe that nobody has put a thermometer on since it left the factory, I cannot tell you what that margin is. Neither can your mechanic, unless he has measured it. Almost nobody measures it. There is a reason pilots hesitate on the knob too, and it is not stupidity. Pulling carburetor heat costs you around 15% of your power, and it does it at the exact moment you are low, slow, and already unhappy about your engine. Then it does something worse, and this is the beat that gets skipped in almost every video on this subject. Hot air is thin air. The moment that knob comes out, you are feeding the same amount of fuel into a thinner charge, and the mixture goes rich. So the engine coughs. It runs rough. It sounds, to a pilot already frightened, exactly like the thing he was afraid of. That roughness is not the ice winning. That is the engine drowning. So you lean it. You pull the mixture back and let it clear, and you leave the heat where it is until the ice is gone. A pilot who does not know that here's the stumble, decides the heat made it worse, and shoves the knob back in, which is the one action guaranteed to feed cold, wet air straight back into a throat that is already glazing over. Nobody had to dig that out of a federal document. It sat in the comment section under the video that told you 83 people died, posted by an owner correcting a gap the film left open. So the physics run wider than the training. The fix costs power, and the fix feels wrong while it is working. What that combination does to actual human beings is written into an accident the safety board chose to print inside its own alert. On the 8th of February, 2012, a Varga Kachina went into a lake outside Frankston, Texas. The man flying it was 85 years old. Private certificate, 5,575 hours in his logbook. That is not a beginner making a beginner's mistake. That is more time in the air than most working pilots collect in a full career. The temperature that afternoon was 48 degrees. The dew point was 37. Run those two numbers through the icing probability chart every one of us was handed in ground school, and they land in the shaded band marked serious risk at cruise power. Read that last part again because it is the detail that should frighten you. Most pilots carry a rule of thumb that says, carburetor ice is a descent problem. Throttle back, low airflow, that is when it bites. Cruise power moves more air through the venturi and generally keeps the throat clearer. 48 degrees and 37 dew point was bad enough to ice a carburetor at cruise, in level flight, with the engine working. Investigators pulled the airplane out of the water and found the carburetor heat control in the cold position. The board's probable cause names the ice, and then it names the decision not to apply the heat. One person aboard. One fatality. Nobody in that cockpit was undertrained. He had 5,500 hours, and he did not pull the knob in air sitting 16 degrees above freezing because the chart he was carrying in his head told him 16 degrees above freezing was fine. Which brings me to the thing that reframes every video ever made on this subject, including the one that sent you here. Not every carbureted engine is equally exposed, and the variable is not the airframe. It is where the carburetor is bolted. Krog laid it out plainly for the EAA in May of 2024. On a Lycoming, the carburetor hangs underneath the oil pan and the induction tubes run up through the oil on their way to the cylinders. The mixture collects sump heat the whole way. On a Continental, the carburetor sits out ahead of the oil cooler with nothing warm anywhere near it. Lycomings resist carburetor ice, Continentals invite it. That single difference should be changing how two different groups of owners fly, and it changes how neither of them do. If your carburetor is bolted to a warm oil pan, you have a margin the man in the Continental does not have. If it is hanging out front in the cooling air, you are the one who should be pulling heat earlier, holding it longer, and treating a 50% humidity day as an ice day rather than a nice one. None of that is in the checklist you were handed. The checklist is written for the airframe. The ice does not care about the airframe. It is an induction geometry problem wearing an airplane's name, and the airplane's name is what everybody argues about. Now, put that against the airplane named in the title of the video that told you 83 people died. The Cessna 172 has been Lycoming powered since 1968. They picked the single most protected installation in the piston fleet and then blamed the airplane. That is a strange thing to get wrong in a video about carburetor ice. Which bothers you more, that they named the wrong engine family, or that nearly 40,000 people watched it and moved on? And the framing error is downstream of a counting error, because two separate federal agencies have already counted this thing. The FAA published a bulletin in June of 2009 that put it at 212 accidents attributed to carburetor icing between 1998 and 2007. 13 of those were fatal. 13 across 10 years. The Safety Board's alert covers a different window and a different dataset. From 2000 to 2011, carburetor icing was a cause or a factor in about 250 accidents. And the board states the average plainly: carburetor icing causes or contributes to 2 fatal accidents per year. 2 agencies. 14 years of overlap between them. The same order of magnitude both times, which leaves exactly one number in this story with no home at all. 83. That is the figure sitting at the top of the video that brought most of you here. 83 Cessna pilots dead in a single year from this. It arrives in the opening seconds. It is never sourced. The year is never named. 3 deaths are actually described across the whole runtime, and at 6 minutes and 46 seconds the narration quietly hedges. Some of them were in those 83 wrecks. So, put it against the ledger. In November of 2025, the Air Safety Institute released its 35th annual report on general aviation safety, covering the year 2023. Across the entire United States, every make, every model, every kind of flying, from ag work to weekend hamburger runs. 1,097 accidents. 186 of them fatal. Non-commercial fixed-wing flying accounted for 156 of those fatal accidents. Mechanical causes of every description, engines, structures, systems, fuel, the lot, accounted for 33. 83 Cessna pilots from one cause in 1 year would be very nearly half of every fatal accident in American general aviation. It did not happen. It has never happened in any year in any dataset that exists. A number nobody can source is not a warning. It is a product. And here is what the real thing actually costs you, because carburetor ice does not send a bill. The landing sends the bill. You come down short, on grass, and the propeller touches something during the rollout. At that instant, an airworthiness directive the FAA issued in 2004 takes over. Not a manufacturer's suggestion. A directive. And its own definition of a propeller strike is far wider than most owners assume. Any incident, whether or not the engine is even running, that needs more than minor dressing of the blades. So the crankshaft area comes apart. Call it $4,000 to pull it down and look. Shops report finding genuine internal damage in 10 to 20% of the engines they open after a strike, which means most owners pay that money to be told nothing is wrong and the directive still requires it. And in the cases where they do find something, a Lycoming 0320 overhaul reusing serviceable cylinders, that is the engine in a Cessna 172, was published at $18,900. There is a part that watches for the ice, so you do not have to guess. The ARP carburetor ice detector has held an FAA supplemental type certificate since 1967. It sits in the venturi and looks for frost optically, instead of inferring it from a temperature gauge. $465. $465 against $18,900. That is the entire argument, and it has been available since before most of these airplanes were built. Which leaves the one question this video cannot close, and neither can anybody else. The Safety Board's alert carries a second accident alongside the one in Texas. An airplane lost power in the traffic pattern and went down. Investigators took the engine apart afterward and found nothing wrong with it, nothing at all, because by the time anyone reached that wreck, the ice had turned to water and the water had turned to air. That is the thing about this particular failure. It eats its own evidence, which means 2 fatal accidents a year is almost certainly too low. Some unknown share of the engines torn down and declared blameless were choked by something that evaporated on the drive to the hangar. The true figure is higher than 2, and nobody, not the board, not the FAA, not me, can tell you by how much. And it is still nowhere near 83. Both of those sentences are true at the same time. Sitting with both of them, instead of picking the one that makes a better thumbnail, is the whole job. Once you understand that a hazard destroys its own evidence, you understand who ends up setting its number. The people who investigate it are stuck with what survived. The people selling it are not stuck with anything. And that is why the honest figure always sounds smaller than the invented one, right up until you check the temperature it happens at. That is what we do with a number here at Sky Ranch. Subscribe. The next one is already on the bench, and it has an airworthiness directive attached to it.